There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with another episode of Zooming In, which is a new series on my channel where I talk with bookish social media luminaries the world over about bookish articles online. And today I'm so delighted to have James from Adelaide, Australia joining us. Hello, James.
Hi, how are you?
Great. And I don't always have James on my channel to talk about Australian literature, but he was the first person I thought of when I came across this article that was in The Guardian about 10 days ago about a new, James will tell us more details, but I think it's kind of a book, introductory biography / literary introduction to the works of the preeminent, the probably the most famous Australian writer in terms of international reputation, Gerald Murnane. And this article, it's actually an excerpt from the book. So the article is entitled, A Homemade Avant-Garde of One. Why is Gerald Murnane revered abroad but divisive in Australia? By Emmett Stinson. And it's an excerpt from the book that I believe James has already read. Is that true, James?
Unfortunately, I haven't read the whole book because my copy I have is as with many books at the moment. I have copy that's supposedly being sent to me, and it's somewhere in the ether. It's on its way, but I haven't actually read it. So they've taken my money, but that along with Solenoid and Seven Twilights and that McInnes book about aliens, all these books are they're well, supposedly coming to me. I don't know.
Well, the mistake you made was ordering one about aliens, and they all got it all tied up into some other parallel reality. So you are familiar with Gerald Murnane. You're also familiar with the author Emmett Stinson. So I'd like you to just give some preliminary comments on the article on Murnane, and we'll just go from there.
Yes, well, I mean, Emmett Stinson is he's American-born, but he's lived in Australia for quite some time, and he's a particular expert on modernist writing and sort of avant-garde writing, but hugely knowledgeable, I think, about Australian writing and publishing. Most of the stuff he's published in the past has been about sort of the Australian publishing and how it works and some of its peculiarities. But yeah, Murnane, I think, is an interesting writer for him to have written about because he is weirdly divisive. I mean, it's Australia, I don't know how unusual this is, but is very much a country that simultaneously loves it when Australians are famous or popular overseas, but is deeply suspicious of people who are popular, that they seem to be getting away with something. And that's coupled with the fact in Murnane's case that he is I think, quite unusual person for a successful writer in terms of the way he writes and lives. And so, yeah, I mean, he simultaneously, every time he's mentioned in Australian newspapers or whatever, he's always talked about as being a constant Nobel nominee, which I'm never quite sure if that's even true because, supposedly you don't know who's been nominated until, years later. But then they did leak like a sieve until recently, so who knows? But so that's always brought up, but also the fact that, yes, he's relatively little read here. And that is because he's not a straightforward realist writer. He doesn't write, books of the sort that are hugely popular homegrown novels here. He's very different from a Tim Winton, who is probably the best known literary success writer in Australia.
I did giggle that Emmett Stinson referred to some of his colleagues who referred to this revered author as Gerald Mundane.
Well, it is weird, sometimes quite patronizing, because as a person, he's someone who, as I understand it, and he's never left Australia. He doesn't really, he lives out in the country a bit, and he just does sort of, has this quiet small town life, doing quiet small town things, which, I never leave the house. I'm not going to criticize that. But that's somehow seen as being deeply peculiar, even though that's how plenty of people live their lives. But I guess because he's not someone who's out there doing book tours, he's not, rushing off to America to capitalize on the success that he's had there recently. I don't know, that is viewed with suspicion by people who don't, I think, understand that you don't have to be, I don't know, you don't have to be a media tart necessarily in order to be successful. And so people, I think, get suspicious of someone who's successful without being a media tart, if that makes sense.
Does. Now, I have read one novel. It's actually his debut novel that was recently brought out for the first time outside Australia, Tamarisk Grow.
Mm.
And I just rewatched my review from about 4 years ago. I'll put a link in the show notes. I couldn't decide, and I still can't decide whether I liked it. I was fascinated by it. His writing style, it's not reader friendly. It gave
No.
me a headache, but a lot of parts of that headache I enjoyed. The
Yes, I feel
half-page
similarly.
sentences.
The first one I ever read by him was The Plains, because I think that's probably his best known book. And
Yes.
I mean, this was about 20 years ago I got this, and it was, it was out of print. I think most of his stuff was out of print. It was really hard to find. I got a copy. Actually, I just checked that the other day. I got a copy for about $20-30, which, and this is apparently now, it's the first edition, so this is now worth a couple of thousand or some ludicrous quantity of money. If I had any idea how to sell books, I could actually do something with it, but no one ever wants to buy them. But yes, and reading it, it was both a slightly alienating experience because it's a book that's sort of set out in a remote part of Australia, and certainly growing up here, you know what kind of book to expect if you hear something described like that, and it is completely unlike anything else I've read, and particularly at that time. And yes, it was an alienating and uncomfortable book, but simultaneously, yes, it works its way into your head. And I found that with all his books that I've read, that they're not friendly, they're not straightforward, but yeah, they get their hooks into you, and he does interesting things in unexpected ways.
And what I have had no experience of, because I've only read Tamarisk Row, but what Emmett Stinson talks about, how he appreciated, I think it was The Plains that he started with, that he appreciated it more the more other books by Murnane he read, that there's a patterning that's going on, and a retellings of obsessive themes and images from book to book that makes all of them vibrate more, which is pretty
I think that's true. He's one of those writers who, they're all very different writers, but like, Bolaño, like Joseph Roth, it kind of feels as though every book of theirs, though they stand on their own, every book of theirs is a chunk of a kind of a massive mega book that they're kind of quarrying out their whole lives. And they resonate with each other. There are obsessions that recur. And I think for some readers, that's, part of the negative side of things. If they read a new book by someone, they want it to be about a different thing. They don't want it to be, worrying away at the same stuff. But yeah, he's a writer who is part of a bigger project. And I think the more of it you read, the richer, retrospectively, the other books you've read become. Which means that you have to kind of settle in for the long haul if you're going to enjoy him more. And that's, that's a big ask for a lot of people. But it's like when someone says to you, you have to, this show becomes really good about series 3, and you say, well, I haven't got time to watch 2 series of something before it comes good. These are good from the start, but to really, I think, get the most out of them, you have to kind of immerse yourself in the whole bibliography.
Somebody whose name is Nicholas Burns said of Murnane, he is both the most Australian of writers and the least Australian of writers. And I warned you I was going to ask you to pick up that ball and run with it. And here is where you do that, please. Can you say more about that?
Well, I think because he he lives out in the country, he doesn't really go anywhere. And this does show through into the books. They are often about rich and obsessive but small lives. In a way, they reflect back on older Australian fiction, which was often, small suburban or country town lives. It's, a hugely urban country. Almost everyone lives on a big coastal city, but the fiction has always represented these sort of small suburban or country town lives. More country towns in Australian fiction than there are in real life. And so he's like that, and in the life he leads, I mean, it's been entirely Australia bound. He's never left the country. He's interested in, he goes down to the local men's shed. He's interested in the horse racing. I mean, it's a very Australian life. But he also, I mean, you read him and his influence. I mean, this is someone who taught himself Hungarian because he wanted to read more Hungarian fiction. His inner world that he writes from, as well as being that small town Australia, is very much a kind of European, particularly Central European, modernist, more peculiar literary world.
Yes.
And that's just as powerful an influence in his work as anything in his lived life.
And perhaps alienating to certain kinds of Australian readers because they're not familiar with it.
That's it. And until recently, there certainly hasn't been. I mean, there've been avant-garde and modernist Australian writers, but they certainly haven't been well supported, well read, well published. I mean, and even now you get a lot of small publishers who will now publish writers. Like Jen Craig, for example, is someone whose work has been published by various small publishers overseas and locally. But until recently, there was no easy way to get her books here. And now finally a small publisher, Puncher and Watman, is publishing them, and you can actually get them. And they're fantastic books. But, that sort of writing has just never been well supported here. And it's only small publishing houses who are willing to take the financial risk to actually take it on and keep it in print. And with Murnane's work, I mean, it was only until recently that, a number of them have been published again by Text and Giramondo, who are two, again, smaller publishing houses here, who have been willing to actually say, this stuff needs to be in print, needs to be available to a local audience.
You've mentioned a couple of times that he hasn't been outside Australia. There's a great sentence here that lists a bunch of other arguably eccentric things about him. So here it is. Murnane has never traveled in an airplane or left Australia, has never had a sense of smell, does not own a television, rarely watches movies, does not attend galleries or museums, does not wear sunglasses, cannot and does not swim in any body of water, does not know how to use a camera, and has never operated a computer.
This is true. But for example, on the other hand, I know someone else who, for example, works for them on music. He provides music and lyrics for tracks, and in one case, an album, a sort of mix of music and spoken word that's, available on Bandcamp and things like that. So that simultaneously, I guess, shows his eccentricity in the modern world, but it does also suggest a more circumscribed life than all of that would suggest. But again, the life he's living is one, I guess, that you describe as being rich artistically, if not particularly interested in the modern world as it is.
He is 84. Has he retired? Has he said that he's hanging up his pen?
Not to my knowledge. I think he's still writing. He has, I think there's supposed to be, more stuff on the go that's being published. And I saw there's another article by Emmett where he interviewed him, which I think is in the book too, where he's got a big drawer of abandoned and half-finished projects, which I imagine is the sort of thing that's going to be, picked over by vultures the moment he dies. But to my knowledge, yes, he's definitely still writing and still working. I should say I'm not completely unbiased in that I through Twitter, I know Emmett and really enjoy his writing and his work, which is why I want the book and I wish it would turn up. But I agreed with the whole thing. And there's a comparison he makes with Joseph Cornell's puzzle boxes.
Yes, that was so interesting.
Had never occurred to me, but it clicked as soon as I heard it, because yes, there's this strange hermetic world of rich and peculiar things, but also very confined and small. And it just seemed like a really good comparison, and not one that had ever occurred to me. But I really liked it. Yeah. I can absolutely imagine a series of his books with the puzzle boxes on the front.
My last question is, I have only read Tamarisk Row. What do you recommend that I pick up next?
Well, I'm biased in that, as I say, it's the first one I read. And so it was the first one that kind of kicked my head into the place where he's writing from. But The Plains, definitely. But also, I really like there's a big collection of his short stories, which I think is, I guess I'd call it a good starting point. Again, it has all of his obsessions and peculiarities, come up again and again, but also the quality of the writing is so strong.
Stinson, in the very first paragraph, says, "There's no easy point of entry," but he says, "My suggestion is the short story When the Mice Failed to Arrive," which contains in miniature the major themes and techniques that he develops across his work. So
yes,
I should maybe start with that story and see how I get on.
But as you know from your own experience, he's not a writer you just read one book of and go, "Oh yeah, okay, I'm hooked. This all makes sense." You know, it's finding your way into an odd little maze.
That's right. Like I say, I still not sure I enjoyed reading that book by him, but I was fascinated from page right through to the end. So, speaking of fascinated, this was a great chat, James. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's always fun.